And we are also live streaming, so we'll share the link via the chat function.
Okay, Sophia, I think you could.
Hello, and welcome everybody to the Tech for TPD or Teacher Professional Development webinar. Today's launch event focuses on the EdTech Hub systematic review on tech-supported teacher professional development in lower and middle income countries. We use the term teacher professional development to refer both to in-service and pre-service teacher education and training. And before I start, I just want to go over a few housekeeping points. You've all been muted to minimize interruptions, as we have a packed agenda, a lot to fit in just 1 hour. However, please feel free to introduce yourselves by writing your name, organization, role, and the country you come from in the chat. We do want this to be as interactive as possible. So please, we encourage you to write your questions and reflections, comments into the chat function. You can choose to send a question directly to panelists or share it with the wider audience. And if the question is for a specific panelist, you can write his or her name, and we will do our best to respond to all questions in the Q&A session at the end of the event, which will be moderated by my colleague and co-author, Salim Kumar. My name is Sophia D'Angelo. I was one of the co-authors of the Systematic Literature Review and its accompanying technical report and policy brief, which we will present today. I'm an independent consultant working for the EdTech Hub and other organizations. I'm delighted to be here today, and we have a very exciting agenda planned with speakers from various countries and diverse roles, but all working directly with teachers in lower and middle income countries. Next slide, please. So a quick background on the EdTech Hub. For those of you who don't know, the EdTech Hub is a research consortium or research partnership whose funded by the UK government. The goal is to empower people by giving them the evidence they need to make decisions about technology and education. We focus on research initiatives that are scalable, sustainable, locally contextualized, culturally appropriate, and cost-effective in raising learning outcomes in lower and middle income countries. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite two of my colleagues and co-authors who will be presenting a summary of the evidence and recommendations from the TPD Systematic Literature Review, Sarah Hennessy and Adam Kramia.
Thank you, Sophia. Yes, as you just announced, we'll be just giving a very brief overview of the main messages and recommendations from the review. And of course, people can look at the outputs if they'd like a bit more detail. The review was founded on the premise that basically developing teachers' knowledge and skills is really important to meet our goal of raising learning outcomes. But teachers in low and middle income countries often don't have access to in-service teacher professional development, and the results of such initiatives are mixed. The provision that's on offer rarely resembles the sort of optimal models. It's often transmission-based, lacking practical application. So we need a more flexible and a locally contextualizable approach to tackle this. So we carried out a comprehensive synthesis of the literature across a 12-year period, and we published the outcomes in a journal article and a policy brief, which you can have a look at. We covered academic and grey literature in the review, and we examined 170 studies in depth and thematically coded and quality assessed them. So this just shows the sort of the topic areas that we looked at, and we, as Sophia indicated, we have the broad definition of teacher continuous professional development, with the technology for mediating it, for supporting it, and low and middle income countries. And as you can see, there's quite a large team of us involved in this review. The structural and the cultural factors that support tech-mediated TPD or hinder it are pivotal. So this is a brief overview of our conceptualization. I won't go into it in detail, but you can see there are three main levels: the macro level, the sort of system or policy level, which might cover, for example, where TPD provision is fractured, different organizations not coordinating, whereas public-private stakeholder partnerships can help to pool the knowledge and share the cost, for example. At the meso level, that's the school or community level, where a collective culture influences teachers' engagement or disengagement, and where targeted school policy or strategies could help reframe the narrative around those embedded cultures. And then we come down to the micro level, the teachers, where most TPD lacks attention to the context in which teachers work. So we need to have needs assessment for what actually is needed in each context. Okay, that was a bit of a nutshell. But now we want to focus on some of the key recommendations that came from the report, and I'll hand over to Adam for this part.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, I'll be taking you through some of the key recommendations from the review, along with the recommendations for each of the areas. So the first takeaway is that while the findings were definitely mixed, there was a lot of evidence in the ways that tech can support teacher learning, as well as coaching, facilitating, peer learning, etc. So just for example, focusing in on communities of practice. So we know that these are increasingly recognized as critical for peer learning and for teacher well-being. And the review found numerous examples of how tech can support and foster these. So effective use of informal social media should be encouraged, at the same time as making sure of the pedagogical rigor of the ideas being discussed and shared, and to ensure that content and TPD objectives are aligned. So the recommendation here is to consider which technology is most appropriate for a specific context in order to catalyze teacher learning and reflection, as well as peer learning. So the second takeaway looks at outcomes. So, next slide. Thanks. So yeah, the second takeaway looks at outcomes, and we found that only 17% of all of the total number of TPD outcomes recorded focused on changes in teaching practice or student learning, which is pretty significant. The majority of outcomes focused on teacher self-reporting, so there's a definite need to increase the amount of direct observation, for example, by head teachers, by implementers, by coaches, researchers, etc. We did find evidence that structured coaching software and observation tools can support coaches and facilitators. For example, Brunsenthal found that external expert coaching via Skype can cost $2.40 per student. And the recommendation here is to ensure that tech-enabled TPD is linked to tangible impacts on classroom practice and student learning, and that these are measured systematically and rigorously. So the third takeaway focuses on equity, and we found that most TPD tends to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, not focusing on gender responsiveness, special education needs, or personalized adaptive learning. We found that few studies use participatory or design-based approaches to TPD. So here we recommend co-designing with teachers and other actors so that TPD is relevant, contextualized, and appropriate for the diverse needs of learners and teachers. An example of where this was done was the mobile mentoring initiative in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya that utilized WhatsApp to provide real-time coaching to teachers in the camp. So the fourth takeaway focuses on cost and cost effectiveness. And again, few studies address this at all, although research does demonstrate that some low-cost options do exist. The seminal study on virtual coaching in South Africa actually found that maybe initially cost-effective initiatives can actually lose efficacy and thus cost-effectiveness over time. And therefore here we recommend to prioritize supportive and constructive human relationships, and therefore to utilize blended models when working with technology. So moving on to the fifth takeaway, again, very few studies focused on this area, and we found that actually less than 1 in 10 studies incorporated sustainability into the design, and less than 1 in 5 were longitudinal or had any follow-up later. So an example of where sustainability was factored is the semi-structured OER for Schools program that was followed up after 18 months. The initiative developed further pedagogical strategies and became self-sustaining because previous participants then became peer facilitators. And this initiative highlights how school and teacher agency is crucial for local uptake, and leads to the recommendation to ensure that sustainability is designed through local contextualization and that there is follow-up for at least a year after the end of TPD. And wrapping up, finally, looking at scalability, which is closely related to both equity and cost effectiveness issues, and is of course critical for the widespread impact of TPD initiatives. So whilst, we found that Kraft and et al.'s review showed that smaller coaching programs tend to be more effective than larger scale ones, other research does demonstrate that the importance of co-designing in effective scale-up. And so the recommendation that we provide here is for tech-supported TPD to achieve nationwide rollout. It is critical to consider how large-scale initiatives can reach teachers without reliable or continuous access to smart devices or technology. And I'm going to pass back across to Sarah for our...
Thanks, Adam.
Students.
Thank you. So I'll just finish by drawing some conclusions. So we see that technology offers huge potential for TPD, but it's not yet being consistently or fully exploited in the most productive ways. We need to stop repeating mistakes from the past and learn from the past successes, but also we need to iteratively evaluate the new materials that we develop and adapt. Importantly, we need to specify and assess learning outcomes and changes in practice. We were quite surprised at how little research seemed to be able to do this. It's crucial also that researchers and TPD implementers measure the added value of the technology and beyond other means, and attend to the cost, the sustainability, the longevity of initiatives, and the scalability. And here, local adaptability is crucial, as we've indicated. Teachers' voices are central in all of this, and designing appropriate technology means conducting thorough needs assessments to inform our initiatives. in particular, access to EdTech and its use has the potential to widen social divides and to further marginalize disadvantaged groups. But in the initiatives that we looked at, there was little emphasis on the needs of marginalized children or teachers. So there's a huge gap there that we need to address. And then finally, it's particularly important to coordinate these large-scale initiatives across all stakeholders, donors, implementers, teacher educators, researchers, coordinate across government departments responsible in any one country as well, coordinate across pre-service and in-service education, and across the different levels in the education system, again, leveraging teacher voices and providing ongoing support. Thank you. So this final slide just has some links to the outputs that we have available. The article I mentioned, the policy briefing. We also have a technical report, which gives many of the figures, the statistics across the field. And the literature database itself is open access, so people can search for their own countries, particular topics, TPD outcomes, whatever you need to look at. And could we have the poll now, Jill? That would be great. So we're going to launch a poll now just to see what you think about some of the key recommendations. We focused on the sort of the most central recommendations in this presentation, which has been quite short. There are more in the outputs, but for these particular 6, we'd love to know your own opinion. So if you could now vote for which recommendation is the most relevant or significant for the context in which you work, that would be great. Thank you.
Is there supposed to be a check mark in the box?
Yeah, you should be able to click one of the boxes, but the hosts and panelists won't be able to vote.
I can't get a check mark in there. Can I make a note of it elsewhere?
Yeah,
In the
sure.
chat then?
Jill, when everybody seems to have voted, could you show the results?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Okay, could we have the results, Jill?
My vote is in the chat.
No, thank you.
It won't be captured, but
Okay.
Can you see?
Yes, we can see them. Thank you. I hope everyone can see them. Gosh, it's quite tight there, actually. Interesting. So the second and third ones are almost tied, and the fifth one as well. They're all around 40%. Interesting. Okay, so it looks like these recommendations have hit home because they've all garnered some support. That's fascinating. Thank you very much, everyone. And the panelists that will be following us with some short presentations will be expanding on some of these in their own presentations. So I will hand back to Sophia now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Adam. I think that was a really great summary of the 170 plus publications that we collected. It's not easy to synthesize so much evidence in such little time. But now we will turn to our panelists to further reflect on some of those findings and recommendations. As a reminder, each panelist will only have 4 minutes to present or share their thoughts. I have to play the role of the bad guy coming in to interrupt if you go over the 4 minutes. So please make my job easier. And we look forward to hearing from you. So first up, we have Winfrieda Jacob Mope and Gervis Anthony, both teacher trainers and educators from Tanzania's teacher training colleges. As you both are co-presenting, you have even the more difficult challenge of sticking to 2 minutes each. I have my trusty timer here. So over to you. Your time begins now.
Hello. Yeah,
Hello.
I will speak on the area of designing TPD that is relevant, contextualized, and they align with the teachers' or student diverse needs. Teachers' professional development can be designed based on teachers' assessment needs. Teachers' assessment needs is continuous process which focus on identifying a gap a teacher have in the area of academic and methodology in teaching and learning process. Through teachers' assessment needs, TPD will fit teachers or learners' diverse needs. In Tanzanian context, teachers' needs can be obtained from communities of learning at school and from teachers' resource centers, where teachers meet for capacity building. A champion teacher who is a peer facilitator at school in collaboration with the head teacher and academic teacher has a responsibility of using various tools such as the checklist, interview, and observation to make sure that these needs are obtained from various areas. Through analysis of assessment of teachers' needs, TPD will be more contextualized as to meet teachers' diverse needs and learners, of which these needs include sociocultural background, experiences, cognitive and physical abilities, and skills. Thank you for listening.
I will talk on the same area as Winnie presented, but I will talk from my experience on working with teachers on TPD, specifically in this region, Southern Tanzania. I think it is possible to work with teachers to design for relevant programs for what they need. For example, in southern part of Tanzania, Mtwara and Lindi, most of teachers, in service teachers, lack the knowledge of using ICT facilities. So, in designing with them, it will be good for them to expose their problem, their need, and to help them. Whereby, by investing on technological needs as their requirement, it will enable them to grow their career and help them to come with relevant materials and technology which will be contextual and relevant to their learners. Hence, they will themselves learn and get enough materials for the learners to learn. So in this part of Tanzania, to take part and invest more in technology is one of the area I think it will help and enhance teachers to develop their career and keep them on learning, as most of them are interested using these technologies in to learn rather than using these hard copy books. Thank you.
Thank you both, Winfrieda and Gervis. Thank you for sticking to the time. That was amazing. Next up, we would like to hear from Joaria Sethi, the founder and school leader of Edopia School in Pakistan. Over to you.
So much, Sophia. I think I'll just wait for my slides. Okay, so the recommendation that I would like to talk about is recommendation number 1, that is to involve teachers in the process of professional development as key stakeholders. There are three kinds of interventions that are there generally when we're talking about professional development. One is teachers' subject knowledge, skills, and classroom practice. And speaking from the example, speaking from my own example and the context that I'm in, I feel that if we do not pay attention to this recommendation of involving teachers, things can go really wrong. And I'll share a very quick example of that. So in Pakistan, there are around 167,000 educational institutes that focus on developing the capacity of teachers as they are in service or pre-service. Next slide, please. But there's a disproportionate emphasis on skills and classroom practice, and very less emphasis is posted on subject knowledge. So consequently, right now in our country, next slide, 70% of the children in Pakistan cannot read by the age of 10. And the reason for that is that the teachers in our country are not usually comfortable with the language of instruction. They don't know the language of instruction. So we have a lot of public schools, a lot of private schools that have English as the medium of instruction. But unfortunately, that's a language that neither the children nor the students know. So children do end up reading phonetically by a certain age, but they do not understand what is being said. Now, millions of rupees are spent in these interventions, these programs, but no one really gets to the heart of the problem as to why the teachers are struggling to help children read. So next slide, please. I feel that, the next slide. You can only solve a problem if you understand the problem, and no one understands the problem better than the ones who are facing it. Next slide. And the one after it, please. Thank you. So now I'll talk a little bit about our context. I run a democratic school in Pakistan. I've been running it for the past 8 years. It's a for-profit school, so we do have better resources to hire teachers who are qualified, but yet they have a lot of gaps in their knowledge. They have areas for growth. So we tried something which was quite unheard of back then, and that was to have remote consultation for our teachers to develop a program for preschool based on the Reggio Emilia philosophy. So I'm just going to explain what worked for us, and hopefully it can be a takeaway for someone. Next slide, please. So we work with Sightlines Initiativ, and in the pictures you can see Robin working with our teachers, but that's only once across all these 4 years that we met him in person. Other than that, it was a remote relationship. Next slide. We use Zoom and Basecamp as our primary tools for interacting with him. And next slide. Here is what worked for us, and we'll just have to keep on clicking now. They took time to know us. They met us where we were. They understood the gaps in knowledge that were there for our teachers. They relied heavily on the documentation and evidence that was provided by us. They prompted us to remain organized across all this time, so they'd send us very frequent reminders to adhere to the deadlines and tasks. And they didn't really readily provide answers. Instead, they co-created meaning with us. They always mutually decided the areas that we needed help with. So there was a lot of ownership of learning as we were proceeding. They respected what the team brought to the table. And lastly, they ensured that there was regular and sustained communication. So what I'm just trying to suggest is that if you want to help the teachers, start with the teachers, respect what they have to offer, and take it from there, and you're going to get better results than just having a savior complex of devising something that maybe the team doesn't really need. So yeah, that's my takeaway. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joaria. Well said. I just want to remind everybody that you can please post your questions, comments, reflections in the chat. Everyone, the panelists, thank you to those who have presented so far. We are on time, and we will have plenty of time for a question and answer session at the end. So please don't be shy and share your thoughts and questions. Now, without further ado, we invite Dr. Ali from the Sierra Leone Ministry of Education. Dr. Ali, over to you. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I am the Director for Teacher Development and Performance in Sierra Leone, working with the Teaching Service Commission. So I'm responsible for all teacher education for in-service, but sometimes I do cross the border to touch on pre-service as well. The systematic review was very informative, and I picked up a couple of points from that I'd like to talked about. First is the increasing publication and what that means for us. Second will be the geographical distribution of the countries that were studied. And finally, the far-reaching impact of these studies, especially for marginalized populations. The increase in population publication on this subject is definitely a sign for us to reckon with. It also implies on the question that regards local educational, higher educational institutions in the country. And it will be interesting to see what's their level of involvement and their contribution to this discourse of technology in teaching and learning. Secondly, the geographical distribution of the country studies shows only 2 African countries with up to 10 studies in this area. Sierra Leone is not among, which is a bit disappointing. However, there are lots of indications that Sierra Leone is willing to embrace technology in education. We are involved in similar studies that is going on, and we hope that this will bring up a light in the tunnel. Finally, the review talks about a far-reaching impact of these studies to marginalized populations. Sierra Leone is just a very, it's a very good context. Lots of schools will have to reach areas, and I think these studies will have to probably help in addressing the high levels of inequality in access to education, which remains a serious question for all of us. Finally, I highly recommend the design of TDP programs that are geared towards sustainability and also that are localized in the local context of wherever these are implemented. I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I hope that this discourse helps us further the improvement of technology-enhanced teacher professional development in Sierra Leone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and thanks again for sticking to your time as well. Now to our last panelist from the Open University in the UK, Mr. Tom Power.
Thank you, Sophia. So 4 minutes, 4 quick reflections. The first is, I was really interested in the conceptual model that underpinned the report and the kind of meso, micro levels and the way that have been used to think about the TPD programs. We've used a very similar framework in a number of different countries when we've been designing TPD programs or researching them that have been using EdTech, and found that kind of framework extremely helpful to think about what is the change in teaching and learning that you're trying to bring about through the program, and what support can you put into the classroom to help teachers make that change? What kind of support can you give to the teachers within the school to sustain that change in teaching and learning practice? And what kind of systemic factors need to be there beyond the school to enable collaboration and fit in with the wider education system? So just commend the kind of conceptual framework is actually a kind of not just a piece of thinking, but a kind of workable methodology for thinking about how you do the kind of co-design and development that people have been talking about in the last few minutes. The second thing, I was really struck by the gap that was identified in community, the role of communities of practice. And in the report where communities of practice are talked about, it's often in kind of what I would describe as a beyond school community of practice. So the question is, how does the use of technology enable teachers to build kind of virtual communities of practice between schools or beyond their geographical location? And we think that's important. I'm also really interested in the role of communities of practice within school in translating what you're learning through your mobile phone or your laptop into changes in behavior and changes in practice in the classroom. So, you know, what is it that allows me to go from looking at my mobile phone as an individual to then doing something different with my children in the classroom to improve learning? And who gets involved in that? What's the role of the head teacher in that? What's the role of other teachers in the school? What's the role of the community in supporting and promoting those changes? And the final thought was around the outcomes and the lack of evidence that there is around changes in teaching practice and learning outcomes. And I think there's some real methodological challenges around that I think as a research community and an international community, we need to kind of work with stakeholders in different countries on the ground to think, well, what are effective ways of assessing changes in practice? We know that teacher self-reporting is hopeless, but are there other ways that are more effective, perhaps more participatory? What are the methodological solutions to that difficult thing of doing large-scale measurement of change in practice? And how do we do that in ways that are affordable and scalable? And I think there's a real kind of methodological debate around how you do that effectively. Thank you, Sophia.
Great, thank you, Tom. I will now pass it over to my colleague and co-author Salim Kumar to facilitate the question and answer session.
Thanks very much, Sophia. And yeah, as we get started on the Q&A session, would encourage anyone to add any questions using the Q&A function just at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you can sort of use the chat there. The Q&A function is next to raising your hand. So yeah, just a quick reflection on all of those panelists and what we've heard just then. I really enjoyed hearing, we saw the sort of macro, meso, micro diagram that Sarah and Adam shared in their first presentation. And what I really enjoyed about those panelists' reflection was just hearing the different reflections from those different points in the TPD ecosystem. And I think that's a real richness from this particular panel today. And so we'll try and sort of target our question and discussion to those different levels of the TPD ecosystem. Before we get into questions from the audience, I did have a couple of questions myself that I wanted to start with, and then we'll sort of move to audience questions. Just building on what Tom just said in that last presentation regarding measuring the impact of TPD, I'd love to hear from any other panelists just on those methodological sort of implications related to measuring TPD, and yeah, but perhaps from the sort of teacher educator perspective, would like to hear from maybe Gervis or Winnie regarding that, but also happy to hear from any other panelists related to that question. Go ahead, Dr. Ali.
I'm just reflecting on my own personal experience. You know, I took up this job a year and a half now, and to my surprise, in Sierra Leone, the teaching service had not really engaged in much studies on the impact of teacher training programs in the country, as well as not much assessment of teachers actually going on in the system, even though they have a traditional way of measuring progress and offering certificates and promotions. But I think it could be more rigorous than that. But that brings me back to the point of the impact of training programs. There's so many. I believe many other countries would be in this similar situation where lots and lots of training is done, and the actual impact of those trainings are not quite precisely being described one way or the other. And I would think that in the addition of statistical tools, there has to be some multi-pronged approach in the assessment of training programs and the impact that they have on classroom outcomes. And that has to do with immediate feedback. First of all, in fact, you might want to do a post-training data collection, and pre-training data collection, post-training data collection, immediate feedback, and perhaps 3 months after that, or after the term or semester, you're going back and collect more data, and from the teachers as well as from the students on specific exercises, depending on what you're looking for. That might involve, and I think it should involve, classroom observations, focusing on specific elements or key indicators, if you want to call them. So it is only through that multi-pronged approach, diversified, for the single goal of actually figuring out what has been the impact of this study, of this intervention on the improvement of whether it's the teacher, and obviously, ultimately how that has translated into classroom outcomes. We do not have one in place now, and I'm very curious to find out, who's got one, what the best practices are in other parts of the world, and how we can look at what exists and localize that for our own context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and I really like the idea of that multi-pronged approach, and really sort of systematically ensuring that we assess the TPD through classroom observations and actually seeing the student learning and the impact in the classroom. As we heard from Sarah and Adam earlier, that very few studies from our review actually assess student impact. I also wonder whether there's a way of integrating the assessment of teacher learning with also continuous needs identification of teachers, and ensuring that approach is sort of coherent across those two particular points. Any other reactions or reflections from any of our panelists on this particular point?
I think something that helps us a lot in the context that we are in is this entire, discipline of continuous improvement in education. So, it just cannot happen after, a certain point, maybe like, for instance, like we're talking about Pakistan. So in Pakistan, things can take a lot of time. When you do a study, and the assessment can take a very long time. But these are the kind of things that need to be assessed on the go. So there is this entire discipline of continuous improvement in education through improvement science, where you test out small change ideas, like bite-sized change ideas on the go. You collect evidence, then you run another PDSA cycle, and you see how far it has gone. And in terms of professional development, something that really helps us is lesson study, which is a Japanese technique as well. It's really common in schools in Japan, where teachers won't generally leave the building for professional development. Instead, other teachers come to their classroom to study what is happening, and then everyone collaboratively talks about what they have noticed, and they have dialogic meetings, and then they build from there. So not always expecting things to be done outside the realm of the school, but always trying to keep it all very well connected within the community, and just to keep the discourse going through proper routines and structures is something that helps us a lot, at least in our context.
Thank you, Joaria. And I really like the idea of focusing on small changes and iterating on those in bite-sized ways. That's a really interesting reflection. Any other comments on this before we move to another question? Oh, okay, perhaps let's move on then. I did note one actually related to Sarah and Adam's presentation regarding how the systematic review team accounted for the quality of evidence across the paper, and just to respond to that really quickly, we did quality score all of the 172 papers within the systematic review, and that was based on the mixed methods appraisal tool, and then we also included additional items that we assessed the quality of evidence on. So yeah, that helped us really whittle down the really key papers from the paper, and you'll see within the paper that we spotlighted 6 initiatives where we saw really sort of good practice related to tech-supported TPD. So a question now on how do you deal with electricity and, oh, sorry, Sarah, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to add that the open database of literature sources does contain the broad quality scoring and also our thematic coding, so people can take a look at that if they want.
Thanks. Yes, so next question. There was one here on how do you deal with a lack of electricity and connectivity for teachers in remote schools? I'd love to actually hear from either Gervis or Winifreda on this particular question, given both of your work with remote schools in Tanzania. Would either of you have any reflections on that? How you deal with the lack of electricity or connectivity for teachers in remote schools?
In our context, for the schools which are in a remote area which lacks electricity, the government has connected them with the solar power. So most of them are connected with the solar, and they use it for teaching and learning process. So they are not connected with the electricity per se, but they are using the solar power.
In addition to that, for the issue of internet connections, most of the mobile operators or providers have not reached all areas in remote areas. However, there are some mobile networks which can be found in some areas. So you may find at a certain school there is a certain place that they can access the network. So once they want to access the internet, they have to go in a certain location and they stay there until they get what they want in the internet.
Thanks both. Tom, I see you have your hand up. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. So this really worried us when we were first kind of doing this stuff in South Africa and Egypt about 20 years ago, and we really had massive anxiety about how anyone would recharge any of the mobile devices or connect. And we spent an awful lot of time as a kind of teacher development and research team thinking of technical solutions to that, from solar power to, you know, generators on bicycles to anything you could think of. What we found out when we actually got going with the first set of teachers was that almost without exception, teachers and school communities solved this problem themselves very quickly. And that the solutions were almost always social rather than technical. So, you know, there's one rural school that there was no electricity in the village, but there was a hospital a mile down the road where they had generators and things, and they talked to the hospital and they allowed them to charge up their mobile devices there and bring them back to the school. In many schools, you found that, you know, the head teacher lived in a village or an area that had electricity, even if the teachers didn't. And they just kind of, teachers always found somewhere, whether it was the market or through people that they knew, they found ways of doing that were kind of social solutions to those problems. In Bangladesh, when we similarly found people found ways of charging their mobile devices, even if there was no electricity in the village. But we found that the provision of teacher learning materials offline was really important for teachers in remote rural communities. So even often the internet coverage, even if you've got a smartphone or something, is really poor or unreliable. The review highlights the importance of video. And I think there's an awful lot of potential for teachers in very marginalized settings for making kind of video resources for professional development and for teaching and learning available offline, preloaded on their smartphone, that they can then use whenever they like, any time, with no cost.
Thanks so much, Tom. And I really like the idea of using solutions that people are already doing to overcome technological barriers and really building on those. That's fantastic. Yes, Dr. Ali.
Yeah, I just want to, I totally relate to what Tom is describing there. And I think that is something that's very prevalent in most of these countries in question. Taking Australian, for example, we have lots of schools in hard to reach areas. And these are in dire need of teaching and learning materials. They are also in dire need of qualified teachers, because most qualified teachers like to stay in the urban areas. So it's even with incentives, it's kind of hard to keep teachers in certain environments, certain localities. But I also want to add that in implementing programs like these, of course, providing schools solar power capabilities is no better way to go. You know, you can't rely on fossil fuel for, especially for African countries where there's an abundant supply of sunshine. So solar power is definitely a way to go. But I also want to, just from my a year and a half experience working here, I see, despite the scarcity of electricity, constant, reliable electrical supply in areas, if you go around the cities, you go around the towns, you go around the villages, they do not have a whole lot of a problem to get generators and fuel to fuel church programs, funerals, and other activities. I think, and they have these loudspeakers, they can go on the streets and promote whatever it is, CD, new programs coming up. And I never see anybody using a microphone for education. So I think it's actually, there's something that I may be wrong, but there's something that I constantly keep asking. You look around the city and towns, you see new buildings propping up here and there. And if you ask, they'll tell you it's a church. Most of them are churches. Hardly any new schools are springing around. I mean, there are schools being built in the countryside and so on. But when you look at those buildings and you compare them to these churches, the churches are magnificent. These are there, they're going to last for hundreds of years. These schools, after a few rainy seasons, they don't, I mean, we all know they don't last very long because of, you know, the funds that's available, how they're built, the structure, et cetera, et cetera. We can put a time on the life of those buildings. So I still think that it's really the political will to invest in these areas, and the leadership in the schools and the school communities are also very important. Do they prioritize education? Do they really prioritize education? If they do, then you put your money where your mouth is. If you prioritize education, then you would know the value of having electricity in the schools. Without electricity in the schools, science is going nowhere. You can't have functioning labs. You can't have study rooms where students can get together and have extra classes in the evenings, for example. So I think in addition to the provision of solar and all other, other supports, I think there's also this human aspect of, really zeroing in on how you do that human resource aspect of it, so that you put people in charge, so that they are actually, dedicated to this. They're passionate about the goals of the project to make sure that it goes through. But I like the idea of Tom's suggestion of providing materials for such communities offline. You can't go wrong with that. Having offline access to offline materials is just a very big step. And I think that will help a lot of teachers and the students in remote areas, and even parents, to access materials on their smartphones if it is available offline, because they can download it and then they can go back to it and use it for learning communities, remedial classes, and so on and so forth. Over.
Thanks so much for those reflections. And just to refer back to that macro meso micro diagram from earlier, one of the cross-cutting elements that sort of run through that particular ecosystem is infrastructure, and that absolutely ties to the point that Tom and Dr. Ali were mentioning there around infrastructure being those school buildings and those sort of broader electrification, connectivity type processes, while also existing at the micro level in terms of offline access in the classroom through preloaded devices or provision of mobile data, like I just saw in the chat there. So Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Time is getting on. I'm hopeful to sort of go through 2 more questions if possible. So I'm going to move the conversation on. The first of those questions, I saw one here around, do any of the reports within the systematic review focus on teachers working with children with communication disabilities, or teachers who themselves have communication support needs or other disabilities? And I know, Adam, you worked on the sort of equity section of the systematic review. So I wonder if you have anything to note on that particular question.
Yeah, sure. I definitely can, but I've seen that Sophia has already typed a very extensive response. I'll hand it over to Sophia to
Well, in short, real quickly, because I think everyone can see that, but this was a huge gap, both for learners with disabilities, which there were a few more, as well as teachers with disability. I think we found one only that was for teachers with visual disabilities in Uganda. It was a 2013 article, and the title is in the chat function. So you can check that out, or the Q&A function. You can check that out. But yes, this is an area where we need a lot more work. And I'm hoping, we can push that forward as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. And perhaps we'll move to our final question then, if no other panelists have anything more to say on that point. And I really like this question, so saved it till last. And this is around sustainability and localization that is needed for tech-supported TPD and LMICs. And the key question here was, how do we move from using these terms as buzzwords to actually having a clear understanding of what sustainability and localization actually look like in practice? And I'd love to hear from a few panelists on this particular question. I wonder who would like to start.
I can start, Salim, just from my experience of working in Zambia, maybe, which is, I think there are a few initiatives that we can look at where this has been achieved or progress has been made in this direction. So I guess we can try and learn the lessons from those and then see whether we can spread them elsewhere. But it's certainly a big gap, as the review indicated. But I think for me, local contextualization means investing quite a lot of time and energy in working with stakeholders locally to really understand the context, to really understand the needs. So it's not a one-off survey, and then what the needs are. It really does take quite an investment of resource to understand the context, but also to co-design materials, TPD initiatives in ways that actually are what's needed, not what we think is needed, but what is actually needed. So I think that's kind of the first point to make. And I think very often there isn't the resource available for that kind of investment, or there isn't the time available. So maybe that's why it isn't done all that often. When we worked in Zambia, we actually developed the OER for Schools program over a 5-year period with really it's very slow burn on small scale to start with, where you are literally, investing in that. Then of course, scaling it up is a whole nother phase, and we need to see whether those small scale initiatives that can be certainly sustainable and proven to be sustainable over time, where schools and teachers take ownership of them, can that model, scale up to a whole country or even to a district or a region? I think that's a slightly unknown question at present. There's a few pockets of good practice where that's been tried, but it hasn't really been done, at scale in a successful way that we can point to, I think. But others might like to come in and disagree.
Thanks, Sarah. Any other reactions, responses to this particular point? Perhaps, Jawaria, given your particular experience in a very localized setting, I wonder what your thoughts are on this particular point.
I generally believe that sustainability is something that comes through structures, and this is something that I guess we learned the hard way, because we wanted to establish a certain discourse, we wanted to establish a certain culture, but a lot of things would just fizzle out, because people change, teams change, the parents that you're interacting with change. So just expecting that the people are just following what you expect, you would expect them to know or they're following your vibe is just not good enough in settings like ours. So for anything to be sustainable, you need to have structure, routines, and protocols. And that is something that has allowed us to develop systems out of ideas, or you just don't have a vision anymore. You have something that can operate even if you step out of that system. So it gets institutionalized. So yeah, for me, sustainability comes through a very well thought of structure that's co-created with the team of people that you're working with.
Thanks so much. Time's just about upon us. Any final comments from any of our panelists before we draw the session to a close?
Yes, I think this is not a question. I think it's a comment to commend everyone here who was involved in putting this together and contributed to it in one way or the other, and in particular giving us the opportunity to participate, those of us who were invited. I think the subject is very relevant, and is looking at the progression of capitalist movements all around the world. I think some amount of people need to dedicate some amount of time to looking at the possibility of providing access to the less fortunate. As I traveled, I've been away from Africa, except for visits in Sierra Leone for very briefly, say once every 2 years. I come for a month. This time I've stayed for 2 years and counting, thanks to COVID. So I have been able to go around in schools, and some of the conditions are very, very bad, just to be blunt. And when you come to the cities, it's totally different. But when you go to these hard to reach areas, children gather around books with, curious eyes, wanting to learn. And you look at teachers, you look at head teachers who are virtually in no position to actually challenge these kids because they have so many other challenges to deal with themselves in their personal lives. I think this is certainly a very worthy cause, and I think I can do nothing more than thank you all very much and wish you all the best, and keep us all in the loop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ali. And I think on that note, we'll draw this session to a close. Thanks to our panelists, Winifreda, Gervis, Jaweria, Dr. Ali, and Tom Power. Thank you to the audience for all your brilliant questions, and thanks as well to the EdTech Hub team on this one. Let's keep the conversation going. And yeah, we really hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah, good to see you, Tom. Yeah. Okay, bye now.